Good morning, everybody. It's good to see all of you, and also all of you that are watching this at a later date in the archives. And just a reminder that all OU Shiurim are archived at ouisrael.org and also at the main OU website. And in addition to them, many of them, including all of these Chizuk Shiurim, are available on YouTube. In my particular case, all you really have to do is just YouTube my name. Just enter Avi Herzog, and all of my Shiurim will come up, as will so many other things that are completely unrelated to me. Maybe it's another Herzog, sometimes it's the president of Israel, sometimes it's things that have nothing to do with any Herzog. It's just for some strange reason how YouTube works. But my shiurim are available there. And again, all of the OU shiurim are archived. Boker Tov to all of you, and it's good to see all of you this morning. A few weeks ago, I focused in this Chizuk session on the name BaMakom for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Today, I would like to continue with that theme, but as it relates to this week's Parashat HaShavua, to Parashat VAYETZEI. So we will open this morning with the first few psukim, or the first story, or sub-story in Parashat VAYETZEI, and then we will go on to a few other sources, all of which will center around the word BaMakom. The beginning of the parasha tells us as follows, and of course, we're all familiar with the text, we're all familiar with the story, and we find as follows. Yaakov must now run away from his brother Esav, who chooses to pursue him. If it were strictly up to him, or if there was simply no other consideration, he could have gone in any which direction. But as we know, he received a directive from his parents to go back to Mom's home, to go back to Haran, and to find a wife from there, from her family. And so the Torah tells us as follows: VAYETZEI Yaakov mi Be'er Sheva, Vayelech Harana. Yaakov left Be'er Sheva, where he had been, Vayelech Harana, and he started his journey towards Haran. Whenever I read that particular pasuk, I would say, unfortunately, think of a joke that I heard when I believe I was in 10th grade. I say unfortunately because I think it's a stupid joke, it's a lousy joke, but it's on my mind now, so I'm going to share it with all of you, and hopefully you'll forget it, or you'll just put it into the recesses of your mind somewhere, and then maybe you'll tell it to somebody else, and either you'll be proud of yourself for sharing it, or like me, you'll be embarrassed that you're sharing it right now. And the joke goes as follows. The principal of my high school, Rabbi Yitzchak Giffen, Alav HaShalom, in Yeshivas Brisk in Chicago, told the following: what is the proof that Yaakov Avinu wore a kippah? And his answer was, the pasuk says, "VaYetzei Yaakov mi Be'er Sheva, Vayelech Harana." Yaakov left Be'er Sheva. Do you really think for a moment that Yaakov Avinu would go anywhere without wearing a kippah? That was the stupid joke. I'm now ready to move on. I got that out of my mind. The next pasuk, on a serious note, tells us as follows: Vayifga BaMakom, he reached the place, and follow here. Vayalen Sham Kiva Hashemesh. He slept there overnight, for the sun had set, or was setting. Vayikach me'avnei HaMakom. Notice the emphasis in my voice. He took from the stones of the place. Vayasem mira'ashotav, which could mean he placed them underneath his head, especially if we're talking about only one stone. We'll get back to that. And to use that stone as a pillow, it could be that he placed the stones around his head, perhaps as some sort of barrier to protect him from animals, whatever it may be. Vayishkav BaMakom hahu. So far we have the word makom 3 times. He laid down there for the night. Vayikatz Yaakov mishnato. I skipped several psukim. He had his dream with the ladder while he was asleep. When he wakes up, what does he do? Vayomer, he says, aha, now that I had this dream, I have this unbelievable revelation. Achen yesh Hashem BaMakom hazeh. Indeed, God can be found in this very place. Va'anochi lo yadati. And up until this particular point, I didn't realize it. Okay. Vayira, Vayomar. And then suddenly he went from this revelation to fear, to fright, because he realized, wow, ma norah hamakom hazeh. How awesome or awe-filled this particular place is. Ki ein zeh Ein ze ki'im Beit Elokim. This is, in a literal sense, the house of God, meaning God's presence is here. V'zeh sha'ar hashamayim, and this is the gate of heaven, or maybe it means the gateway to heaven, because after all, I was able to have my dream here and experience the malachim olim liordim, ascending and descending. 4 times the word hamakom. And then the Torah tells us as follows: Vayashkem Abraham baboker, he awoke in the morning. Vayikach et ha'even, he took the stone that he placed mira'ashotav, asher sam mira'ashotav, again, either underneath or surrounding his head. Vayasem otat matzeva, and he used that stone and erected it as a monument, as a testament to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Vayitzok shemen al rosha, and he poured oil over it, which was, of course, a form of anointing in those days, and it still is on certain occasions today. And then the last pasuk tells us as follows: Vayikra et shem hamakom hahu Beit El. He named the place Beit El. The pasuk goes on to tell us V'ulam Luz shem ha'ir la rishona, that Luz was the name of the place originally. He now renamed it Beit El. And especially if we follow the Midrash, and we will get to that a little bit later, I believe, if we have time and if I remember to do so. Especially if Beit El here is a reference to not the Beit El that we know today, and not another Beit El because there was more than one, but rather it's a reference to none other than Har HaMoriah itself. He indeed is giving it a new name, because we do not find until this point in time that Har HaMoriah, or that Yerushalayim, the general area, which of course in that time was a very tiny area, is referred to as Beit El. So either way, he names it the house of God because he indeed experienced God there in a very strong sense of the word in his dream. Okay. The word hamakom then finds its way into this text 6 times. Clearly, it is directing our attention to the idea of hamakom. Let's begin with the fact, and we'll come back to this, that as soon as Yaakov reaches, or is on his way to Haran, and reaches this particular place, all the Torah tells us is, Vayifga BaMakom. Ba, as we know, is a compound of biha, the place. He didn't just reach a place. The text is telling us he reached the place. But there's no indication to us up until this particular point in this particular story what place we're referring to. And yet it's a definite article. It's not just some place. That would be Vayifga BaMakom, or any other particular construct, grammatical construct. Vayifga BaMakom means only that he reached the place. Chazal then decide, if that's the case, we have to define what that particular place is. That's how they come to Har HaMoriah, which we indeed, in Yirtzeh Hashem, will see a little bit later. But let's just divert our attention for a moment to a very well-known piece of Gemara. And the Gemara tells us as follows: Itmar, which means there is a machloket of Amoraim, a machloket of Talmudic scholars. Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina, Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Chanina, he says as follows. By the way, this Gemara can be found in Masechet Brachot, and he says as follows: Tefillot avot tiknu. The tefillot of the day, meaning the idea of the fact that we pray, that we daven thrice, 3 times daily, can be attributed to the avot. Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov are the ones that instituted the thrice daily tefillah. However, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi Amar, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi disagrees, and he says, Tefillot keneged timidim tiknu, that the tefillot correspond to the korban tamid, to the daily korban. The word tamid, we know the word to mean always, or constant, continuous, and the idea behind calling it a korban tamid is simply a reference to the fact that this is a korban that was brought daily, every single day, continuously. One did not miss a day unless there was a specific reason why we were not able to enter the Mikdash. For example, when there was no Mikdash, or when we were forbidden to enter the Mikdash in the story of Chanukah, up until Baruch Hashem, we were able to retake the Mikdash. But in any event, that is why it's referred to the Korban Tamid. It corresponds, says Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, Tfilah does, to the Korbanot Tamid. In other words, we had the Korban Tamid Shel Shacharit, we had the Korban Tamid in the afternoon, and then in the evening, what was offered on the Mizbeach were the remnants of the Korban Tamid that was not yet, that had not yet been burnt during the course of the day. That's the idea behind Tfilat Arvit. But all of it gets back to the Korbanot Tamid. Okay. Tanya Kavatei Rabbi Yossi, the Gemara continues. We have a Braita that supports the idea of Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina, and we have another Braita that supports the idea of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. This morning, we're going to focus only on the first one, and that is the opinion of Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Chanina, that tefillot avot tiknum, that it was our avot that instituted the tefillot. Now, before we go any further, I would just like to suggest, and I've not seen this anywhere else, that perhaps there is not necessarily any machloket here, but rather, Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Chanina, the one that says tefillot avot tiknum, is drawing our attention to the concept of tefillah. In other words, the idea of tefillah, big gadol, in general terms, of course, was already out there. Others obviously prayed to God before Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov came along. But the idea that one must reach out to God, as we will see, either in thanks or in prayer, in beseeching, in the morning, in the afternoon, and in the evening, were instituted by the three avot when we take all of their particular choice of times together. That's the very general concept of tefillah, the idea of tefillah, and when it takes place. As opposed to the other opinion of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, tefillot avot tiknum, I believe that's a reference not to the concept of tefillah. Tefillah had already been conceptualized and perhaps practiced, but rather that is referring not just to the concept, but also to the construct and the constraints of tefillah. How we daven, when we daven. So, for example, as we will see in just a moment, the idea of davening in the morning comes from Avraham Avinu. Okay, but the morning as we know it begins as the sun rises and lasts all the way until, we'll call it noon, or until chatzot. Comes along the halacha and says, no, because the Korban Tamid had to be offered within a specific time frame, which was a shorter time frame than that, and therefore Tefillat Shacharit really should only or best be davened lechatchila during that particular time frame. And the same thing goes for Tefillat Mincha. Tefillat, the Korban Tamid, could only be offered at a certain time, and therefore we also only daven at that particular mincha during that particular time. It's not just whenever we feel like. In addition to that, we know that the tefillot themselves incorporate into it a tefillah of v'techazena einenu. We look forward to the day when we can return to the Mikdash. The idea of that being in our tefillah indeed is going back to the very the approach of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi of Keneged Timidim Tiknum, that these tefillot, Shacharit, Mincha, and Arvit, were set up, were organized around the Korban Tamid. And so we tie the two together. Let's go a little bit further. The Gemara tells us as follows. Here is the Braita that supports Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina, that the tefillot, or as I said, the concept of tefillah, were instituted by the Avot. Abraham tikein tefillat shacharit. Abraham is the one that instituted the idea of tefillat shacharit. Shene'emar, there is another pasuk that says, that says regarding Abraham, Vayashkem Abraham baboker. It's important to point out that nowhere in the Torah does it tell us that that Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov actually prayed. That root, Pei Lamed Lamed, or anything related to it, is not found. Instead, there's a pasuk which tells us, Vayashkem Abraham baboker. Abraham awoke in the morning. El HaMakom. There seem to be some words missing here. He woke up to the place, towards the place. It obviously means he woke up and then he was on his journey to the place. Asher Amad Sham. He was on his way to the place where he had stood, meaning where he had stood previously. The only verb here, other than vayashkem, that he arose, is amad, stood. And the pasuk tells us he went to the place asher amad sham, that he had been previously. And the Gemara goes on to tell us, quoting the Braita, ve'ein amidah ela tefillah, that the term amidah, whenever it appears in the Torah, and it means whenever it appears, is not only a reference to pshat, to the story that's going on, because here it does mean a place that he had been before, that he had stood before, but in addition, not instead, but in addition, it also refers to tefillah. In other words, that he had stood there in prayer. So in order to be able to justify the idea that the shoresh, ayin mem daled, standing, is a reference to tefillah, Chazal, of course, need a backup. They need what we'll call an asmachta, or a proof text. And that is, Shene Emar, as it says elsewhere, Vayamod Pinchas Vayifalel. Understanding the word Vayifalel as it has perhaps, and I'll leave the why I'm saying perhaps for a different time, not for today, that Vayifalel, Pei Lamed Lamed, shares the same root as the word Tefillah, which may or may not be Pei Lamed Lamed. Vayifalel, then, even though it's a different verb construct, could be what we would refer to as Vayitpalel, he prayed. Vayamod Pinchas, Vayifalel. He stood and he prayed. In other words, he stood in tefillah. So if he was standing in tefillah, then whenever that same root is used in the Chumash, it is a reference, in addition to the level of Peshat, it is also an allusion to prayer. And if it refers to prayer by Pinchas, then when the Torah tells us that Abraham returned to the place Asher Amad Sham, where he had stood before, it means to the place where he had stood and davened in the past, and maybe was davening now too. Okay, let's leave that aside. Yitzchak tikain tefilat mincha. This one's a little bit more direct. Yitzchak is the one that instituted the idea, the concept of tefilat mincha. Shene Emar, we need a proof text for that too. And we're told, before we get to the proof text, the text regarding Yitzchak is, what do we find? And remember, we don't find that he davened in the text itself. Instead, this is from last week's Parashat Shua, from Chayei Sarah, when Eliezer was on his way back with Rivka, and Yitzchak had gone out to the fields, and suddenly he notices that these camels are coming, and he sees Rivka for the first time. The pasuk tells us, VAYETZEI Yitzchak, Yitzchak went out lasuach, like the word sicha, as we're having right now, a discussion. Actually, we're not having a sicha because you're all muted. So it's not really a discussion. It's rather Avi Herzog is going on, and none of you will even attempt to interrupt me because there's no point, because you're muted. Although the truth is, I would love for this to be a sicha, for this to be a conversation, for this to be a dialogue. It just can't work within this particular framework. But in any event, VAYETZEI Yitzchak lasuach basadeh. He went to converse, to engage in dialogue. Yes, to talk, but it's not ledaber. Lasuach means to engage in dialogue. But if he's there by himself, thinking about it for a moment, he has to be engaging in dialogue with somebody. The word lasuach is not talking to yourself. The word lasuach is not just simply speaking. It means having a conversation. You cannot converse unless there is somebody or some other entity involved in that particular sicha. So he went out to the field, basadeh, lifnot arev towards the evening. And then Chazal go on to say, okay, keeping that in mind, if there's nobody else there, we know where this is going. Ve'ein sicha ela tefillah. The word sicha is also a reference to tefillah. In other words, it's a dialogue, or at least it's a give and take, or there is somebody on the receiving end if they're not responding. And in that sense, this morning we indeed are having a sicha. And that is also why very often a musar shmuz in the modern yeshiva world is referred to as a sicha, even though there's not necessarily a conversation going on. One person is speaking, but the idea behind it being that there is somebody that is receiving and listening to the information. So there are two sides involved. So ve'ein sicha ela tefillah. That too is a reference to tefillah. In other words, the other one involved here is none other than HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself. Shene Emar, the proof text for that is elsewhere where we find the word sicha or siach or the root word sin vav chet. The Torah tells us Tefillah le'ani ki ya'atov, the tefillah of an ani, of a poor person or a person who is downtrodden, ki ya'atov, when he wraps himself. Think of the imagery, if you will, of a talit, or not necessarily, but rather a person wrapping themselves in a cloak, v'lifnei, maybe in modesty, whatever it may be, v'lifnei Hashem, and before God, yishpoch sicho, he pours out his, not tfilato, but rather sicho, his siach, his sicha, his conversing, knowing that there's God there on the other end, who is the counterpart involved in this particular tefillah. Okay, that's Yitzchak. And then for our purposes this morning, the Braita ends with the following. Yaakov, Tikain Tefilat Arvit. Abraham, Shacharit, Yitzchak, Mincha. Yaakov is the one that instituted this very idea of tefillah, of reaching out to God in the evening. Shene'emar, as the pasuk says, yes, we opened with this pasuk this morning. It is the second pasuk in Parashat VAYETZEI. Vayifga BaMakom. He reached the place. Vayalen Sham. Okay, the verb Vayifga, he reached. And the Torah tells us, the Gemara, the Braita tells us, Ve'ein pigi'ah ela tefillah. The root, pei gimel ayin, of reaching, in this particular case, Vayifga BaMakom, reaching the makom, whatever that makom may be a reference to, that verb of reaching also refers to tefillah. Now, how in the world did Chazal know that? So first of all, we'll begin with a proof text, and then we'll take it one step further. Shene'emar, the proof text is, in Sefer Yirmiyahu, Ve'ata al titpalel ba'ad ha'am hazeh, al titpalel, do not pray for these people, they do not deserve it, they have been, suffice it to say, very bad boys and girls, as it were, and I'm not going to listen. Ve'al tisab ba'adam, literally don't lift on their behalf, and in other words, don't lift up your voice in prayer on their behalf. Rina utfilah, Rina and tefillah. Ve'al tifga bi, God is saying. The same word that is used by Yaakov Avinu. Ve'al tifga bi. Don't reach, let's add the word out in English, don't reach out to me. I'm not going to be there for you. Getting back to our text, with Yaakov Avinu, Vayifga BaMakom, he reached not just the place, but he reached out. And just as God said to him, Al tifga bi, Vayifga BaMakom is also a reference to the exact opposite, because it's written in the positive, not in the negative. Vayifga BaMakom, he reached out either in the place or he reached out to HaMakom. Now think about that for a moment. On the Pshat level, it literally only means that Yaakov Avinu reached there, whatever the there may be, and it's a definite article. He reached the Makom, not just any old Makom. Okay, so Chazal understood that perhaps this is a reference to Har HaMoriah. And it occurred to me when I was reviewing this text again this morning in preparation for right now, it occurred to me for the first time that why in the world did Chazal attribute the Makom to Har HaMoriah? What made him come up with that? And I thought for a moment that the Midrash that does comes up with this idea of the Makom referring to Har HaMoriah, it might be this particular pasuk. They may have been thinking of this other Braita, maybe not, but which states, Vayifga, which tells us, Vayifga BaMakom. He reached out to the Makom. Suddenly then, Makom here is not just a reference to the physical place, it's a reference to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And perhaps they understood that Vayifga BaMakom means that he reached out to HaMakom, as in Baruch HaMakom Baruch Hu, as in HaMakom Yinachem Etchem Betoch Sha'ar Avelei Tzion V'Yerushalayim, as in HaMakom Yirachem Aleihem V'Yotzi'ei Mitzara V'Yirvacha. All of that is included in the words Vayifga BaMakom. He understood that now that he had his dream, before he had his dream, he understood now that he reached a place safely and he's able to sleep overnight, that he needs to reach out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, number one, in prayer that he is safe throughout the night, and in thanks, of course, for the fact that he now has a place where he can simply lay down to rest for the night. That's Yaakov Avinu, Vayifga BaMakom. Taking that, we can then, taking that forward, we can then understand, as I mentioned before, how this may explain the notion that this particular place they came to was Har HaMoriah. In fact, Rashi quotes that particular idea, that particular midrash, and tells us, Vayifga BaMakom, he reached a place, Lo Hizkir HaKatuv Be'ezeh Makom. The pasuk does not mention which particular place. Ela BaMakom. It says he reached the place. So one way to go with that is to imagine to ourselves what that place might be. I apologize. We already engaged in a very brief discussion as to why it is that Chazal interpreted that to be Har HaMoriah. But in fact, we know how writing works. Writing works as follows. If a person refers to the place, as in a definite specific place, and the place is not mentioned there, one needs to go back to the previous time that either a particular location is mentioned, or the way that Chazal are understanding it, in this case, where the word HaMakom is used previously, or regarding what place the word HaMakom is used previously. And Rashi indeed quotes for us the Midrash that tells us, here, BaMakom is not defined, so indeed it must be referring to HaMakom, HaNizkar, in Rashi's words, that is mentioned, BaMakom Acher, that is mentioned elsewhere. Who? Har HaMoriah. And that place is Har HaMoriah, because there, when Abraham Avinu was traveling, the Torah tells us, Shene'emar bo, it says about him and about it, Har HaMoriah, Vayar et HaMakom Merachok. He saw the place from afar. He saw the place, Har HaMoriah, off in the distance. And if there, in that particular context, HaMakom is referring to Har HaMoriah. So here, the term HaMakom or BaMakom, HaMakom, is also a reference to Har HaMoriah. But as I mentioned before, I think there's more to it than that. I think that Chazal looked at, the authors of this particular midrash, looked at the text of our parasha, Vayifga BaMakom, understanding that on a newer level, on a deeper level, Vayifga BaMakom is not just that he reached the place, it's that he reached out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In that very same place that Abraham Avinu was bidden by Kadosh Baruch Hu, not just to offer up his son as a korban, but also to reach out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Because as we've discussed in the past in some of my shiurim, and many have written about or talked about in their classes, and their shiurim, what HaKadosh Baruch Hu really wanted from Abraham Avinu at Har Moriah was to say, hold on a second, God, what gives? He wanted Abraham Avinu to step up, not just to pass the test in terms of being willing to do what HaKadosh Baruch Hu asked of him, but being willing to literally be Vayifga BaMakom, to reach out to God in that particular place and say to him, God, you need to help me understand what you're all about. So in that particular sense, Abraham Avinu also reached out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Har Moriah, and his grandson, Yaakov Avinu, followed suit. Vayifga BaMakom. Yaakov Avinu reached out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And something else just happened here, if you didn't pick up on it. If Yaakov Avinu's Vayifga BaMakom is a reference back to Abraham Avinu's being on Har HaMoriah and Vayaret HaMakom Merachok, then what we're really doing is showing that there is a beautiful synthesis of the two different ideas that are presented for us in the Braita with which we began this morning from Masechet Brachot in the Gemara. Were the tefillot instituted by the Avot, or were the tefillot instituted to recall the korbanot? It's both. Isn't it both? I began by stating that I personally believe there may not be any machloket here, that one is referring to the very concept of tefillah, that's the Avot, and the other is referring to the construct of tefillah, and that's the korbanot. But the two go hand in hand. Yaakov Avinu and his davening One of the avot tiknu, directly corresponds to Abraham Avinu's experience at Har Moriah, being willing and ready to offer up his son as a korban on Har Moriah. The two are interconnected. They are not separate ideas. Both of these ideas inform what our tefillah is supposed to be all about. Both of these ideas help us to understand what we are to engage in and how we are to approach HaKadosh Baruch Hu if indeed we really fully engage in what tefillah is all about. It's about recalling that the Avot reached out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and it's also about recalling that original experience of Abraham Avinu on Har Moriah on that particular korban. Let's just think about that for a moment. And as we're thinking about that, I would like to end with another message that also emanates from this morning's parasha. And we're familiar with this particular midrash that Rashi also brings to our attention. There seems to be a discrepancy in the wording. First, the Torah tells us that Vayifga BaMakom, Yaakov reached a place, and what did he do? Vayikach mei avnei hamakom vayasem rashotav. He took from the stones of the place, or of the stones of the place, and he placed them mirashotav. I mentioned at the outset, mirashotav could mean underneath his head as a pillow, because if referring just to one stone, he wouldn't put it aside or near his head. That would serve simply no function. But rather, he placed it underneath him, or mirashotav, which really should mean surrounding him. If that's the case, it's referring to more than one stone. But let's be clear. The Torah itself does not tell us whether he took one stone or whether he took several. The Torah tells us simply that Vayikach mei avnei, he took from the stones of, not he took the stones of. What he took is not written in the plural. He took from a plurality of stones. How many he took, one or several? We cannot know that from the particular text. In fact, Ibn Ezra and others are of the opinion that he simply took one and he used it as a pillow. He placed his head upon it. He placed it, mirashotav, literally underneath his head to serve as some sort of pillow for the night, because that's all he had. That was the best that he could do, as uncomfortable as it was. Rashi will disagree, it seems, by quoting the Midrash, and so Rashi tells us as follows. Asa'an, he took the stones in the plural, kimin marzev saviv l'rosho, as some sort of protective wall surrounding his head. Because obviously he was out in the open, so he was concerned that maybe he would be attacked by wild animals in the middle of the night. So he built some sort of fortress around him. Okay. A beautiful midrash. The stones began to argue with one another. I personally do not take these types of midrashim, these metaphors, you know me by now, to be meant literally. Just like I do not believe that the moon and the sun literally duked it out, according to the midrash, and that the moon actually physically complained. No, the moon does not have the power to speak, but rather, according to the Rambam, this is not just Avi Herzog, but it's the Rambam himself and many others who believe that these types of midrashim are not meant to be taken literally. And the same thing would be true here. The stones didn't physically argue it out. That has nothing to do with the reality. But rather, the Chazal are portraying for us a certain imagery in order to convey a certain message. And here's the message. They began to argue with one another. Zot omeret, one stone said, Al alai yaniach tzaddik et rosho. On me, this great tzaddik, this righteous individual, Yaakov will place his head. V'zot omeret alai yaniach. And then the other one chimed in and said, no, let him place his head upon me. So each one of them wanted to have the zechut, wanted to have the privilege of being used as a pillow, because it should be pretty clear, I suppose, that in addition to building this fortress around him, he was also going to use one of them to not use one of them for the fortress, but rather to place his head upon. And if that's the case, each one wanted in on the action. So what did HaKadosh Baruch Hu? He decided, you know what? I'm going to answer the tefillot of all of them. Miyad asa'an hakadosh baruch hu even achat. Hakadosh Baruch Hu somehow melded together all of these avanim. And whether or not this is meant to be taken literally or not is completely besides the point. It's the idea behind it. Hakadosh Baruch Hu took them melded them together and formed them together into one stone. And that is how the pasuk can switch from the plural, if indeed it is understood to mean that he took plural stones, into the singular. Because once he awakens, the Torah tells us, Vayikach et ha'even, not ha'avanim. There it is clearly in the singular. He took the stone that he placed beneath his head, Vayasem otam matzeva. It's a pasuk that we quoted earlier with which we began this morning, and he decided to repurpose this stone for a higher purpose, and that is for a matzeva, to erect a monument and a testament to God and to the fact that God appeared to him in that particular place. Vayifga BaMakom. Yaakov Avinu reached the place. Did the Avot institute tefillah? People were davening before, but they added a new dimension to it. Do our tefillot correspond to the korbanot? Indeed they do. Tefillah encompasses all of the above. And so I would simply like to end our sicha, lasuach basadeh, our sicha this morning, our short time spent together learning Torah, with a tefillah to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that indeed we have suffered enough korbanot. We have suffered enough human korbanot. We do not need any more. But at the same time, it's a tefillah of v'techezena einenu, that we will indeed have the opportunity not only to see Be'ezrat Hashem soon, and it seems like it may be on the way, to have all of our hostages returned, and not only an end to this particular milchama, where we and all human beings upon the entire planet will be able to literally and really live with everlasting shalom and shavah, but at the same time also for us to be able to offer up our korbanot in the place of the mikdash, in the place where Yaakov Avinu may or may not have been, but in Yirtzeh Hashem again, on Har Moriah, where Abraham Avinu definitely was. Be'ezrat Hashem, may we see that opportunity soon. B'meira v'yameinu. Okay, we will conclude our shiur for this morning, and I wish you all a good day.